I always believed the rules of the game were straightforward. Work hard, be loyal, deliver results. Do that, and you earned respect. Or so I told myself for years. For more than a decade, I built my career on that simple premise. I missed anniversaries, skipped birthdays, and gave up weekends because the company needed me. I wasn't a cog. I was the person they called when everything was on fire. I fixed problems. I smoothed circuits. I took blame when leaders panicked, and I did it without applause. He wore tailored suits and a smile that hit a knife. The CEO, polished, charming, and absolutely ruthless, ran the company like an empire. He cultivated loyalties, rewarded visibility, and punished anyone who got in the way. I learned to navigate his mood swings, show enough competence to be useful, not so much ambition that you threatened him. For years, I balanced on that tightrope. The dismissal came on a Friday. He summoned me to his office for what I assumed was a debrief. The room smelled faintly of cologne and old leather. He stood, slid a folder across the desk, and without meeting my eyes, delivered the line that unraveled everything. We're moving in a different direction. Your services are no longer required. There was no fury, no negotiation, no gratitude. He read a script that ended a decade of work in 6 words. I left the office with a box of personal effects and a feeling I couldn't name. Part numbness, part outrage. But that night, the humiliation curdled into something darker. I went over the moments when I had bent over backwards. The nights I'd stayed to finish a presentation he took credit for. The crises I'd absorbed so the C-suite could sleep. The ledger of my life at that company suddenly looked one-sided. The thing about being fired by someone like him is not the job itself. It's the message. It's the public display of power. He wanted to show everyone who watched that loyalty was expendable and that fear bought absolute obedience. He wanted the smirk. And that smirk, the tiny, satisfied curl at the corner of his mouth as I left, is what set the plan in motion. Revenge isn't a single act. It's a cold, patient architecture. I knew that to beat him, I needed more than rage. I needed leverage. So I began to gather pieces of leverage the way an engineer gathers parts for a machine. First, there were the quiet favors I had stored across teams. A procurement lead who still copied me on vendor invoices out of habit. A junior analyst who idolized the way I solved problems and would answer a message in a heartbeat. An old controller who'd been sidelined into retirement but still had access to legacy files. Those relationships weren't loyalty to me alone. They were fractures in his facade. The second piece was information. From years inside the room, I'd seen the difference between what looked good in a press photo and what lived in the spreadsheets. He loved to spin growth stories, sign big-name deals, and send out celebratory emails. Behind the scenes, though, shortcuts multiplied. Budget lines that ballooned to feed consultants with familiar last names. Vendor contracts awarded with suspicious haste, and approvals issued in the whisper of late-night emails. None of it screamed criminality on the surface, but together they painted the outline of a reckless ego prioritizing optics over governance. So I started connecting dots. I made quiet requests for files through those contacts I could trust, cross-checked timestamps, and archived emails that contradicted public statements. It was methodical work. Late nights piecing together an invisible ledger so the story would stand up under scrutiny. Every time I found a mismatch, a pattern, or a forged approval, the plan gained teeth. The third piece was perception. He was not only a CEO, he was a brand. LinkedIn posts, keynote smiles, investor photos, all carefully curated. To remove him, I had to puncture that image with facts precise enough to withstand PR spin. A smear wouldn't do. It would be dismissed. I needed a clean case, documents, corroborating witnesses, and a timeline that left the board no comfortable excuses. I reactivated a small network inside the company. People sidelined by his style. The compliance officer whose red flags were ignored. The project manager whose requests vanished into a black hole. Their accounts filled gaps numbers could not, but they feared retaliation. So I built methods for them to share documents anonymously, compiled evidence in neutral formats, and created redundancy, copies stored in multiple secure repositories outside his reach. Timing became everything. I tracked board meetings, earnings calls, and investor announcements. The aim was surgical: reveal the inconsistencies when the company's defenses were thin, before a funding round just ahead of an annual review, at the crest of some PR triumph. Momentum is easier to build when you can burst through confidence at the moment it's most visible. Doubt crept in, as it will for anyone who chooses a path that walks along ethical edges. This wasn't about petty vindictiveness. It was about accountability. I kept reminding myself that the objective was to expose decisions that threatened the company and its people, not to humiliate someone for sport. That rationale kept me measured. I refused to stage things or manipulate facts. The entire operation relied on truth, verified, documented, and undeniable. The first small victory arrived from a tiny oversight, an automated vendor approval loop that routed to a long deactivated alias. In that thread, I found approvals matching dates on invoices that paid a consulting firm with a direct tie to one of his private ventures. The connection alone wasn't prosecution material, but it was a clear conflict of interest. I saved the thread, corroborated it with bank-facing invoices, and tucked it into the file. Then I assembled a dossier for a journalist I trusted, not accusatory, but factual. I sent documents stripped of names and accompanied by a timeline and corroborating witnesses. The reporter asked pointed public questions. Management's standard denials followed: rehearsed statements, no comment, and platitudes. But denials without documents are paper thin. Behind the scenes, the board noticed. That was the first sure sign that momentum had shifted. He reacted in ways that betrayed his discomfort. His tone in interviews sharpened. Tweets came through more defensive than triumphant. He tightened his meetings, truncated attendee lists, and doubled down on loyalists. Paranoia makes people reckless. He started micromanaging approvals and slowing hires. Small errors crept into his decision-making, the very mistakes that leave footprints. I was careful with my tracks. Communications went through encrypted channels and intermediaries. I used aliases and kept a chain of custody for each document. Mistakes here would dismantle everything and could even expose me legally. So I built redundancies, multiple secure backups, witnesses who could independently confirm timelines, and an off-site repository a regulator or trustworthy journalist could access if necessary. Revenge taught me discipline. It taught me that anger without process leads to sloppy actions that can be dismissed. Instead, I cultivated patience, precision, and allies. I assembled categories of evidence: conflicts of interest, approval irregularities, and operational negligence. And within each category, I stored timestamps, corroborating emails, and witness statements. The goal was a mosaic, no single tile dramatic enough to indict, but together they created an image the board could not ignore. The first domino to fall wasn't a sensational headline. It was a quiet resignation from a procurement head who refused to sign a suspicious contract. Their exit note contained language HR couldn't sanitize, mentions of pressured sign-offs, executive overrides, and audit requests ignored. When paired with the documents I had released quietly, that resignation note created a pattern that shifted how the board viewed previously dismissed anomalies. Someone in the boardroom finally asked for an audit. Once the audit was requested, the board's attention fractured in the way I had predicted. He tried to control the narrative with legal teams and glossy presentations. He called for closed-door briefings and rallied his loyal lieutenants. But the architecture of concealment he had relied upon depended on a uniform willingness to look away. With fractures and audits and resignations, that web began to unravel. I watched from a distance as the marketplace of perception turned. Investors started asking questions in public forums. Analysts tweeted cautious threads. The PR machine moved into defensive mode. But PR can't create documents. It can only dress them. The company that once seemed invincible now had fissures. He was no longer the unassailable figure at the center of the room. He was a man managing damage control. The most satisfying moments came not from seeing him embarrassed, but from watching accountability take shape. Staff who had been ignored found their concerns amplified. Auditors followed threads that led back to decisions he had signed off on. The board, which had once applauded his aggressive growth narrative, asked for evidence. And evidence is a stubborn thing. Still, risks remained. Retaliation is a familiar move for powerful people who feel trapped. They enlist lawyers, threaten countersuits, and use delay as a weapon. I expected every tactic and prepared for them. That's why I spread the evidence across multiple channels: journalists, legal counsel specializing in corporate governance, and a regulator known for following paper trails. If one avenue stalled, another could proceed uninterrupted. I didn't celebrate in the way the tabloids imagine. There is no joy in watching livelihoods tremble, but there was vindication in seeing systems that enabled mismanagement be questioned. When power relies on silence, breaking that silence is a service. The smirk he once wore, the one that made me burn with humiliation the day I left, began to feel less like a brand and more like a mask slipping. As the pieces moved into place, I felt a cold clarity. This was no longer personal. It had transformed into a larger reckoning, a confrontation between fabrication and documentation, between curated image and cold facts. The board, the press, and the market would decide the outcome, but I had done the work to allow the truth to be seen, and still I waited. Watching a plan unfold is a test of resolve. Each new public question, each internal audit request, each resignation note, they all fed the momentum. The CEO could call in favors and spin narratives, but once the scaffolding was exposed, control slipped through his fingers. That smirk would either remain as bravado or dissolve when the facts arrived in the open. When the next meeting was called, the one where auditors presented findings and the board asked the questions I had been preparing them to ask, I knew a tipping point was near. He had fired me thinking the story about me had closed. Ironically, by trying to erase me, he had set in motion the one thing that could finally hold him to account. He thought he had buried me. He hadn't imagined I'd become the person who could translate what I'd seen into a story that respected evidence, cadence, and timing. When the first public document dropped, and the boardroom had no easy platitudes left, the real test would begin. Could power survive when the record contradicted the narrative? One smirk separated triumph from collapse. The answer would come in the boardroom, in audit memos, and in the quiet lines of an investigative reporter's piece. The moment of reckoning was approaching, and with it, the place where a carefully assembled plan meets the chaos of reality. The boardroom is not a battlefield of swords and shields. It's quieter, more insidious. The weapons are numbers, charts, carefully worded memos, and reputations sharpened into blades. I knew if I wanted to topple the CEO, I couldn't storm the gates. I had to slip in through the cracks, let doubt spread like smoke, and allow his empire to choke on its own fumes. My first strike had to be subtle. Too aggressive, and I'd expose myself. Too soft, and the momentum would die before it began. So I chose a pressure point I knew he couldn't ignore. Money. You see, every great empire has an Achilles heel. For this CEO, it was his obsession with appearances. He wanted to look unstoppable in front of investors, flawless in front of analysts, and untouchable in front of the press. But to build that illusion, he cut corners, and those shortcuts always left trails. I dug deeper into vendor contracts, following the paper trail like a detective tracing footprints in the snow. Patterns emerged, payments authorized on weekends, duplicate invoices approved without oversight, consulting firms tied to his personal contacts, all draining funds under the guise of strategic growth initiatives. One particular contract caught my eye, a multi-million-dollar deal pushed through just days before an earnings call. On paper, it was for market research, but the deliverables? Vague, no timelines, no measurable results. The money had disappeared into a black hole. Yet he paraded the deal as proof of innovation spending. It was perfect. I packaged the evidence into a clean, digestible report and made sure it landed in the right hands. A journalist who specialized in corporate accountability. Not an enemy of the company, but someone who had built a reputation for accuracy. Someone the public trusted. The article dropped like a whisper at first. A headline tucked in the financial section, read only by those who cared about numbers. But whispers spread. Investors read it, analysts questioned it, and suddenly, those same strategic initiatives the CEO bragged about looked suspiciously hollow. The beauty of the first strike wasn't the damage itself. It was the ripple. His carefully crafted image cracked. He scrambled to explain away the contracts, called it a misunderstanding, promised transparency. But once people smell smoke, they start looking for fire. Inside the company, employees started whispering too. The contacts I'd cultivated fed me updates. His temper flared in meetings, his paranoia grew. He slashed access to files, tightened security, demanded loyalty oaths in the form of silence. Every move he made confirmed guilt more than it denied it. And here's the cruel irony. The more he tried to control the narrative, the less control he had. Investors hate uncertainty. The board hates exposure. And nothing breeds exposure faster than a leader who looks like he's hiding something. But I wasn't finished. The first strike was only the beginning. The second phase of my plan involved allies he didn't even know existed. People whose careers he had crushed, whose warnings he had ignored, whose ideas he had stolen. One by one, I reached out, carefully, quietly. They were hesitant at first, afraid of his power, afraid of retaliation. But fear has a funny way of flipping when people see a predator stumble. Once they realized the CEO wasn't invincible, doors began to open. Whistleblowers emerged. Former executives confirmed my suspicions. Internal emails surfaced. And suddenly, I wasn't the only one building a case. A silent coalition was forming, bound not by friendship, but by a shared hunger for justice. And he had no idea. While he barked orders from his office, while he tried to reassure the board with flashy presentations, a storm was gathering in the shadows. Every secret he thought was buried, every shortcut he thought was invisible, was being unearthed. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was bigger. It was about every person he had silenced, every employee he had discarded, every career he had crushed under his heel, and together we were sharpening the knives. The brilliance of revenge is patience. I didn't rush the second strike. I let the first ripple spread, let doubt fester, let fear infect the ranks, because by the time the second blow landed, it wouldn't look like an isolated problem. It would look like a pattern, and once the board saw a pattern, they couldn't ignore it. He had smirked when he fired me. That smirk was gone now, replaced by a clenched jaw and sleepless nights. The man who once looked untouchable was beginning to sweat. And sweat, in the corporate world, is the first sign of blood. But this was only the warm-up. The real strike, the one that would shatter him completely, was still to come. The first strike rattled him. The second left cracks in his armor. But the third was designed to break him in public, where no amount of spin, no amount of legal jargon, no amount of staged smiles could shield him. I knew this stage would be the most dangerous. Quiet leaks and whispered doubts are one thing. A full-scale exposure is another. Once the third strike landed, there would be no turning back. It would be war in broad daylight. I studied him like a hunter studies prey. His weaknesses weren't just in numbers or contracts. They were in his habits. He thrived on control, on being the smartest person in the room, on silencing dissent with intimidation. But when forced into the spotlight, when pressed in public by questions he couldn't script, he stumbled. So I chose my battleground, the quarterly earnings call. Every 3 months, he performed like a polished actor, walking analysts through record growth and strategic initiatives. But I knew the numbers were smoke and mirrors. I had the documents, the patterns, the inconsistencies, and I knew that if the right people asked the right questions on that call, his mask would slip. Through my coalition, I funneled evidence to analysts who were already suspicious. I didn't tell them what to say. I gave them facts, timelines, and anomalies they couldn't ignore. By the time the call began, I had loaded the chamber with questions sharp enough to cut through his rehearsed lines. The call started like any other. His voice calm, smooth, dripping with confidence. "We've had another strong quarter," he said. "Revenue up, market share expanding, a clear path to long-term growth." On the surface, it sounded convincing. But underneath, every word felt hollow. I could hear the cracks even if the public couldn't. Then the first analyst asked the question I had planted. "Can you clarify the discrepancy between the $14 million allocated to consulting in Q2 and the $22 million actually spent? The numbers don't match the filings." For the first time, his voice wavered. Just slightly. He chuckled nervously, tried to brush it off. "Sometimes reporting timelines don't align perfectly," he said. "It's standard practice." But the follow-up came sharp, almost merciless. "Then why were those funds routed through an offshore vendor not listed in previous disclosures?" Dead silence. I pictured the board listening in. I pictured investors taking notes, and I pictured the smirk wiped clean from his face. From that moment, the call spiraled. Question after question pressed him on inconsistencies. His answers grew shorter, sharper, defensive. The confidence that once defined him had curdled into panic. What was supposed to be a victory lap had turned into a public interrogation. By the end of the call, the stock price dipped. Not catastrophic, but enough to rattle nerves. And in the corporate world, perception is everything. The whispers of doubt had become headlines. Inside the company, the atmosphere shifted. Employees who once feared him began speaking more openly. Department heads whispered that the boss looks weak. The board, once silent cheerleaders, now sent curt emails demanding explanations. I had forced him into the open. And once the public saw weakness, there was no way to hide it again. But exposure is a double-edged sword. The more pressure I applied, the more desperate he became. My contacts told me he started holding closed-door meetings at odd hours, demanding loyalty, threatening anyone who questioned him. He fired people suddenly, trying to reassert control, but each desperate act only fueled the perception of instability. Still, I wasn't naive. I knew he wouldn't go down without a fight. A man like him doesn't crumble quietly. He strikes back. And soon I felt the retaliation, anonymous threats, my phone buzzing with blocked calls, a car parked too long outside my apartment, small reminders that he still had power, still had reach, still had resources. It was his way of saying, I know it's you. And he was right. For the first time, I felt the weight of the game I was playing. One wrong move, one exposed connection, and everything I had built could collapse. I could lose not just the revenge I'd planned, but my freedom, my safety, maybe even my life. But fear is a strange fuel. It doesn't weaken you if you know how to use it. It sharpens your edges. It keeps you alert. And in that moment, I swore I wouldn't back down. If he wanted war, he would have it. The difference was, I wasn't fighting alone anymore. My coalition had grown stronger. The journalist had more documents than she could print in a month. The analysts smelled blood in the water, and the board, whether they admitted it or not, was starting to prepare for life after him. The unraveling had begun. And once you start pulling at a thread, the whole fabric eventually comes apart. The company was crumbling around him, but men like the CEO don't fear losing a business. They fear losing themselves. Their carefully built image, their private empires, the secrets they've buried so deep they believe no one can touch them. I had weakened him in the public arena, but I knew if I wanted to destroy him completely, I had to reach past the company and into the shadows of his personal life. Because behind every ruthless executive lies a network of shell companies, hidden accounts, and dirty deals that never make it into the quarterly reports. And I knew exactly where to look. Over the years, I had sat in too many late-night meetings, listened to too many offhand remarks, and seen too many unexplained transactions to believe his personal fortune was clean. He flaunted wealth like a badge of honor, the mansion, the cars, the vacations that made headlines. But money leaves trails, and arrogance leaves clues. The first crack came from an overlooked detail. A consulting firm he insisted the company use for strategic partnerships. On paper, it was independent. In reality, it was tied to an offshore entity he controlled through a maze of shell corporations. Millions flowed through it quietly, siphoned from the very budgets he bragged about cutting. My coalition went to work. The former controller dug up old invoices. A quiet IT contact retrieved archived email threads. A whistleblower slipped me copies of wire transfer confirmations. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together. A secret empire funded by company money, hidden in plain sight. But here's the thing about skeletons. Once you find one, you rarely find it alone. Digging into his finances revealed more than corruption. It revealed betrayal. He had been double-dealing investors, selling off company assets through third parties he secretly owned, pocketing the profits while telling the board they were strategic divestments. And worse, he had ties to political donors, moving money through back channels to buy influence. This wasn't just corporate fraud. This was corruption on a scale that could ruin him forever. The question wasn't whether I should use it. The question was how. If I moved too fast, he would bury it in lawsuits, drag me through courts, and spin it as a vendetta. But if I moved carefully, if I planted the right seeds in the right places, his entire personal empire would collapse under its own weight. So I set the stage. I fed documents to regulators anonymously, ensuring the trail looked like it came from multiple sources. I gave journalists small but verifiable pieces, enough to run stories without exposing the full hand. And I ensured the board knew just enough to be terrified of what else might surface. Then I waited. The first headline hit like a thunderclap. CEO linked to offshore firms and secret payment scandal. It wasn't the whole story, but it was enough to spark outrage. Investors panicked. Politicians distanced themselves. Employees whispered openly in the cafeteria. The board called an emergency meeting. And for the first time, the man who had fired me with a smirk was no longer untouchable. He was radioactive. I watched from the outside as he tried to fight back. He held press conferences, calling the reports fake news. He hired lawyers to issue threats. He pointed fingers at rivals, at journalists, even at former employees. But none of it worked, because the documents were real, the evidence was undeniable, and the more he shouted, the more guilty he looked. Behind closed doors, I heard he was unraveling. Rage-filled tirades in board meetings, sleepless nights, desperate phone calls to allies who no longer returned them. The predator had become the prey, and the world was circling. But as satisfying as it was to watch, I knew this was the most dangerous stage. A cornered animal doesn't surrender. It lashes out. The threats escalated. My emails were hacked. My phone pinged with warnings of attempted breaches. Friends told me strangers had been asking questions about me. It was his way of firing back, of reminding me he still had claws. And yet, the more he fought, the more he exposed himself. Every attempt to silence the story only made it louder. Every denial gave reporters another headline. Every counterattack confirmed the board's worst fears. The skeletons were no longer locked away. They were marching out of his closet, one by one, under the harsh light of public scrutiny. But I wasn't done. Because the next strike wouldn't just expose corruption. It would show the world who he truly was behind the mask. And once the mask comes off, there's no putting it back on. Money can be explained away. Contracts can be spun. Even offshore firms can be disguised behind legal jargon and armies of lawyers. But there is one thing a man like the CEO cannot recover once it's destroyed: his image. For years, he had cultivated a reputation as the visionary leader, the self-made genius who carried himself like a titan of industry. The media adored him. Business magazines ran glowing profiles. Politicians shook his hand and praised his entrepreneurial spirit. Employees were taught to revere him as the architect of their success. But reputations are fragile. They look solid on the surface, but the moment the foundation cracks, they shatter like glass. My plan was simple. If I could show the world who he really was, arrogant, manipulative, corrupt, and cruel, then no amount of spin would save him. Because once the public loses faith, power evaporates. Investors flee, allies vanish, boards cave, and even the strongest empire collapses. I started small. Quiet leaks to journalists about his behavior behind closed doors, accounts from former assistants he had berated in public, stories of careers he had ruined with a single phone call. It wasn't just about fraud now. It was about character. The media loves a fall from grace. For years, they had built him up as a genius. Now they were eager to tear him down. Headlines shifted from visionary to tyrant. The same reporters who once praised his leadership now called him toxic. Anonymous employees spoke out, their words painting a picture of a man who thrived on fear, intimidation, and cruelty. Then came the photos. He had always believed he was untouchable, so he never hid his excesses. Private jets, lavish parties, questionable company-funded trips to luxury resorts. I had photos, receipts, and itineraries that showed him spending company money not on strategy, not on growth, but on indulgence. And when those images hit the press, the mask cracked further. But the final blow had to be undeniable, something so raw, so damning, that even his most loyal allies couldn't defend him. And I had it. Buried in years of emails, I found a thread he had forgotten to erase. In it, he mocked his own employees, calling them replaceable cogs. He laughed about layoffs he had orchestrated, joking about how fear keeps them sharp. And worst of all, he admitted, in writing, that he fired me not because of performance issues as he had claimed, but because I had gotten too close to uncovering his schemes. That email was the smoking gun. I made sure it reached the right people. First, the journalist who had been following the story, then the board, then finally the public. And when it was published, the world saw the truth. Not just about the fraud, not just about the offshore money, but about the man himself. The fallout was immediate. Employees revolted. Investors demanded resignations. Politicians who had once smiled for photos with him scrambled to distance themselves. The board, cornered and humiliated, called an emergency vote of no confidence. For the first time, he was stripped of the thing he valued most, his image. The mask was gone, and beneath it stood nothing but a desperate man clinging to power he could no longer control. But cornered men don't just surrender. Reports reached me that he had begun digging into his enemies. He wanted names. He wanted revenge of his own. He had hired private investigators, lawyers, even hackers to track down whoever had orchestrated his downfall. And though I had stayed in the shadows, I knew it was only a matter of time before his gaze turned toward me. The game was entering its final stage. Because once he discovered who had outsmarted him, there would be no more hiding. It would be a fight to the finish. The empire was crumbling, but the man himself refused to fall quietly. I had ripped away his fortune. I had shredded his reputation. I had exposed his secrets one by one, until the mask he wore for decades was nothing but fragments on the ground. Any rational person would have fled, disappeared into the shadows with whatever scraps remained, but not him. For men like this CEO, power isn't just a tool. It's their identity. Without it, they're nothing. And he would rather burn everything down, himself included, than admit defeat. The storm began with whispers. Friends called me, warning that strangers were asking questions about me. Former colleagues mentioned being approached by consultants digging into my past. Then came the digital attacks, attempts to breach my accounts, fake profiles spreading rumors, anonymous threats dropped into my inbox. He wasn't just fighting back. He was hunting me. And for the first time, I realized the revenge story I had been writing might cost me everything. Because when you push a man with nothing left to lose, you awaken the most dangerous version of him. Still, I wasn't going to run. If he wanted a war, then war is what he would get. I doubled my defenses, encrypted everything, set traps in my systems to track whoever tried to breach them, and slowly I began to notice a pattern. His investigators weren't professionals. They were desperate hires, amateurs throwing everything at the wall. He was losing control, even of his counterattack. But then he made his final mistake. In his desperation, he tried to use the board one last time. He convinced a handful of loyalists that if they could prove I was behind the leaks, they could sue me, ruin me financially, and claw back some control. He even had the audacity to schedule a press conference, where he planned to stand before the cameras and declare himself the victim of a conspiracy. That was the moment I decided to end it. I timed my move with precision. Just hours before his grand defense, I unleashed the final piece of evidence I had kept in reserve. A full dossier of his crimes. Corruption and fraud incomplete with timelines, bank transfers, offshore documents, and testimonies from those he had betrayed. But I didn't just send it to the press. I sent it to law enforcement. By the time he arrived at the press conference, smiling for cameras and rehearsing his speech about conspiracies and betrayal, the world already knew the truth. The headlines weren't about his defense. They were about the arrest warrant issued against him. The cameras he had summoned to save him instead captured his downfall. He never made it to the podium. He was escorted away in handcuffs, his last words drowned out by reporters shouting questions he couldn't answer. The man who once stood untouchable at the top of the corporate world now looked small, broken, and powerless. And me? I didn't cheer. I didn't celebrate. I simply watched, knowing the cycle was complete. Revenge isn't about applause. It's about balance. It's about making sure the powerful who abuse others pay the price they thought they'd never face. In the weeks that followed, the company rebuilt itself without him. The board scrambled to restore trust. Investors trickled back. Employees who once lived in fear finally breathed freely. But as for the man himself, his story was over. The last I heard, he spends his days fighting endless legal battles, his fortune drained by settlements and lawyers, his name forever linked to scandal. The mansion is gone. The cars are gone. The magazine covers that once praised him now sit in archives as cautionary tales. And me? I walked away with something far greater than money or power. I walked away with proof that no matter how high they climb, no matter how strong they think they are, even the most untouchable giants can fall. Because when arrogance meets persistence, when corruption meets truth, and when cruelty meets justice, there is only one possible ending. The empire burns. The mask shatters. And the man who thought he could destroy me learns the truth. Was never the victim. I was the executioner.